Hey everyone, Ethan here from Extreme RC 4x4. Today I'm going to be installing my trailing arm kit onto an axial SCX10.2. I'm going to be covering everything that's included with the kit, tools we need to use, how everything goes in place, and what else you'll need for the install. So the kit itself consists of two trailing arm mounts that we have here that go on the chassis. Two of these shock mounts that will bolt onto the stock shock towers, cross member for these shock mounts, and then a new servo winch mount to replace the stock one. And for hardware we have this rod, of course, the four 3mm lock nuts, two 3x22mm screws, four 3x20 screws, two 3x14 screws, four 3x12 screws, and then four 3x8 screws. And along with that, to complete the install, I have three of these 3D printed spacers that will help with the install. Alright, so with all that squared away, what you get with the kit, you're going to need two trailing arms to complete the install. This kit uses axial Yeti trailing arms or the equivalent, so by that I mean aftermarket trailing arms for the axial Yeti. Should work. I think the Bomber actually uses the same trailing arms as the Yeti as well, but you have to check into that. So, getting into the install, first thing I like to do is remove these side trays. I'm going to start on this side because it is simpler. And to remove this tray, we just have two screws right here on the chassis that will pull off. And then with those two screws removed, we need to remove the screw that's on the frontmost part of it. It's a smaller 2.6mm thread instead of the 3mm. And now what we're going to do is take this small screw, the 2.6mm one, and we're going to put it back where it came from, just without the side tray. Okay, so now we're going to be installing these the trailing arm mounts that go on the chassis side. So let me quickly explain this to you guys. If you're at the 11.4 wheelbase, this farthest back screw is going to go right here in that hole, and we're not going to mess with this furthest back rear upper link screw. Now, if you are running the 12.3 wheelbase, a reference that you can use for that is that this hole right here will be your front upper link hole that will go right there. Hardware is included to complete the install either way, but this is the 11.4 wheelbase, so I'm going to go ahead and show that to you guys. Now, for hardware, we're going to use a 14mm screw for the length here, and this is going to replace these screws that mount the side tray, and I'll show you. The screws are just slightly longer in order to compensate for the added material. And like I said, the furthest back hole on this will be mounting right there. Okay, so this is not a required step, but I like to do it just for a more secure mount. We have these 4 20mm screws, and we can take, even though this has no upper link in it, we can still install this upper link screw here in that place in order to secure this frame mount better. Just get it started in here, and then we're going to take one of these 3D printed spacers and use it so that this skid plate doesn't get crushed when we snug it down. So there you can see, just takes up that dead space in there and gets everything nice and snug. So we can go ahead and look at how it turned out on the frame side here. This screw was the only one we didn't mess with, and that's because this is the 11.4 wheelbase. If you're running the 12.3 wheelbase, you'll also replace this screw with one of the 20mm that's included. But as you can see, right between the frame and the side tray still mounts up there. The reason that that screw is no longer attached is just because of the space. So I didn't see any reason to throw a spacer in there, I guess. But now we can go ahead and I guess do the exact same thing to the other side. What I'm going to do first though is remove this servo winch mount right here, which you can put a block on like this in order to mount a servo winch to. So we're going to have to remove this from the bottom first, at least just from the battery tray side. Pull that screw out of there. Alright. Try to set all the stock hardware aside. So this side is basically identical. We're just gonna remove this side tray and then get started. The only difference is that we'll have to remove the front upper link screw. And again, we'll remove the small screw on the front of the tray and then reinstall it. I'll actually leave that screw in there just to keep everything lined up while we're messing with everything else here first. So, this servo mount we're going to be replacing with our new one. Want to just line this up here first. So the long side will be the side on the receiver box, because that's the side that's getting pushed out further. The reason this needs to be replaced is because we're moving this 1/8 of an inch off the chassis, so a new piece needs to be made. So I'll just remove this off of the receiver box and reinstall my own. And then just do our best to line that up like it was, just to run straight across the chassis. Okay, now we can remove this upper link screw, take our frame mount piece here and set it back on the chassis, set a screw back in for the front upper link, And then of course replace the factory hardware on the side tray. Sorry guys, I think I mentioned that these were 14mm screws. They're actually 12s that we're installing on the side tray. And again, like I was telling you guys, we do not mess with this rear upper link screw unless you're running the 12.3 wheelbase, which I think is the more common one. And here you can see it's just spaced out a little bit, so just move that and then reinstall that screw. We can do that from the bottom side, just like we removed it. Okay, so that's just a nice little touch I like to put in there. I like to make sure all of my products are the complete setup if you're doing the conversion, so hopefully that'll help some of you guys out if you are running a servo winch. I didn't want to just put a 3D printed piece there just because servo winches can be ridiculously strong. Okay, now we're going to get into the more fun side of this, I guess, and just take the hubcaps off the wheels, remove the wheel nut, and take the wheel and tire off. Then we're going to remove the shock completely. Keep the screws with the shock. And this lower screw that we have for the shock, we're going to reuse on the trailing arm. Just put the shock into the trailing arm, and then our stock screw will go in. Once we have it through, we can put one of the included lock nuts on that and snug it down. Doesn't need to be ridiculously tight, just into the part of the lock washer that locks in place. And we can set this setup aside for the moment. Next we'll be installing the new shock mount, which is, this piece right here. It goes on with a triangle facing down, but you can set it up however you want. It just screws into the factory shock tower. And it's installed with two 3x8mm screws. Now down here at the axle, we're going to disconnect the stock lower link. And at the same time, I'd recommend removing that link from the chassis. I'm just going to put this screw in place here. can remove the link from the truck, and we can start installing the trailing arm. So what we'll need is one of our 14mm screws and a lock nut to install the trailing arm at the mount. We're going to be installing it outboard of the mount. And then we can snug that down. And then we'll take one of our 22mm screws and put it through the trailing arm rod end, get it started in the axle. It's mounting on the outside of that shock mount as well. Once we have it in there, we can throw another one of our spacers in place. Alright, so now I'll give you guys a little bit of a look at this. So, trailing arm is mounted outside and outside here as well. We have our spacer in place so that we don't crush those lower link mounts. And we can set it back up in place here. I recommend you use the lowest shock mount. If you'd like to use any of the higher up shock mounts, you will need a spacer to space the shock out slightly so it's not in contact with it. Or you could flip the triangle upside down and use this mount and have the rest of the material on the top side. Now we'll be taking the rod that I have supplied and using that as a nut for the shock almost. Just snug everything up. So now we have this side complete, and I can go ahead and reinstall the wheel and tire with the lock nut and then the hub. Alright, something I like to compare right now while I have the other side completely unmodified is where the shocks bottom out. That is what I like to keep the same as the point where they bottom out. Our contact point from the factory is the axle's upper link mounts seem to hit this cross member. So both shocks are bottomed out right now and at almost exactly the same height, if not exactly. So that is what I kind of like to go off of for these trailing arms. So you get extra droop, but you're still going to get the same point where they bottom out. Okay, now we're going to do the same thing on this side. So might be a little bit repetitive, but simple. Get our wheel and tire off here. Now we're going to remove the shock. And I would like to mention to you guys, I do mount the shock in the rearmost position on the trailing arm. I know I didn't mention that last time, but that is the mount that I go for. If you're looking at purchasing aftermarket trailing arms from the beginning, SSD makes a nice set, which I have just installed on my Trail Runner. As you guys know, that was the first vehicle I installed trailing arms on. the lower link. Now we'll install the trailing arm again, a 14mm screw at the chassis side with our lock nut on the back. Now we'll do the same thing on the axle with their 22mm screw. Okay, and the last thing to do is install our shock mount again with these 8mm screws. The triangle faces downward. And I'm just going to install everything loosely on here. Since the other side's already snug, go ahead and install this shock screw first before I snug everything down. And then I can snug it all up. Alright, finally put our wheel and tire back on, and then we can have a look at the final product. Alright, so the only pieces of hardware left remaining are these two 3x20mm screws, and they are left because this is the 11.4 wheelbase. You would have used these on the rear upper links at the 12.3 wheelbase. So, you're probably wondering, what is the benefit of running trailing arm suspension? The benefit is that you get an increased suspension travel with the same length of shock. This is pretty common on desert running vehicles and has been a very high demand product for me for the trail runner. So I wanted to make a kit for the SCX10 because it has been asked for. So I'll show it to you guys. The only real downside of this kit is that it is going to decrease your ground clearance at the center of the chassis. But to a lot of people it is worth it. It's not a huge decrease, but it is definitely there. I do angle, in the design there are angled pieces so that it kind of slides across them rather than just catching on something. Some things that I do in this kit, like the servo winch mount here, I do just to really complete it in the rear with the shock towers. I wanted to keep the factory shock towers in place so that you can continue running the body that you're running if you're using body pins. And by just making these kind of shock keys here that bolt up to the shock tower and then have a cross member between them, it really makes sure that you get a nice stiff shock mount. And I added the cross member not because I needed to, I just added it from the beginning because I felt that would be a good idea. Being that we're mounting the shocks so far away from the shock towers, should add some nice rigidity to this subframe that we've kind of created here. But this will also give you additional flex if you are looking for that out of your truck. You can get some pretty good flexibility out of these setups. I have been enjoying running it on my trail runner, even though it's not really a high-speed vehicle. It does seem to help with performance, even just in the flexibility, if not the additional droop that you get. So that's what I was showing you guys as well. The shocks bottom out at basically where they bottom out from the factory, but you will get additional droop. So if you notice, the rear axle hangs lower than the front. I do have some different adjustments you can make on these, but like I said, you will need a spacer in order to do that. So it's a very complete kit. All the hardware is included, of course, and you get to keep the electronics trays on the side. Very simple mounts on the frame, and they do work with both wheelbases. So I'll go ahead and set this up for the 12.3 wheelbase so you guys can have a look at that as well. But I would like to show you the drive shaft angle first, as it does remain acceptable throughout the suspension travel. So geometry is still good, nothing to worry about there. And I'll go ahead and get that 12.3 setup done so you guys can see that. Alright guys, my apologies. I thought I had those links made up to work with this, but it turns out the rods are actually a 4mm thread, I think, and I made mine for a 3mm thread, and I don't have a 4mm thread tap on hand, so just gonna have to go off this. It is designed to work with the 12.3 wheelbase, and this does keep the wheelbase the same. I know a lot of people wonder about that. That's a lot of questions I was getting with the Trail Runner kit or the Element Enduro kit. This will work with the solid front axle, but I know a lot of you guys have also swapped these trucks over to the IFS from Element, and that's where this kit really shines. It plays a good part in the performance of my Trail Runner, I think, because the IFS is a little limited on flex, so the trailing arm kit makes up for that. But this one is actually specific to the Axial SCX10.2. As you can tell, very complete kit, and I had a lot of interest from people asking if this kit was available for the SCX10. Well, now it is. I hope I've done a good enough job explaining to you guys the whole install. The kit is available on my website, extremrc4x4.com. And also check it out for your other parts needs or desires. But anyways guys, thank you very much for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next video.